Okay, thank you so much. And hi, everybody. It's so good to see people here in person after such a long period in COVID where we've been in isolation and really had to rely on online interaction. I'm so pleased that we have so many faces here today. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Chinachem and Hong Kong GBC for this opportunity. And before we get started, I'd just like to share something that's related to the COVID discussion. I actually stayed in the Nina Hotel in my quarantine next door. Just goes to show that how things have come somewhat full cycle. And I'm hoping that, the quarantine will be a thing of the past and Hong Kong once again will open up and will return to our normal state of affairs. So my job now is to really kind of bring the interesting discussions that have been taking place in the early part of this morning and try to connect the dots between these different discussions, because as the moderator summarized, I mean, they are quite different yet related topics, and we really need to draw drive these points about the connection on them. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists a separate question. I've also got a tablet here with a number of questions that come from the floor. So if you don't recognize your exact question, don't worry. I'm actually going to weave it into the questions I'm going to ask the panelists. So maybe let me just start with the overview from Professor Tai, from Singapore. And Professor Tai, you gave a really fascinating discourse on process, behavior, and net zero organizations. And one point I picked up on there was that you talked about, will energy decide development planning? In other words, in the future, when we look at land use, rather than look at land use for the sake of housing or utilization, you actually made the point that energy will drive where we decide where to build next. Could you maybe just very succinctly explain your point there?
Thank you. Well, urban planning is one of the key influencer of sustainability outcome. And even until today, when I speak, ask any planner, how do you determine what sort of flow ratio, what sort of development intensity to a city? Of course, we understand based on development economics, based on the price of land, supply and demand. I think all those are valid. But if we want to pivot quickly to a net zero outcome, how would you do it differently as a planner? I asked this question. And for too long, planning tools does not contain sustainability KPIs. And we need to ask ourselves this question, why? So one of the clearest thing that we have to deal with in building is definitely energy. Of course, we can add many others to it, carbon as well. But when will these items or factors feature in planning requirements? I think as regulators, we should start to think about that. Not immediately, of course, I understand it takes time, but in the near future, I think we should start to think about layering on top of it a requirement of energy issue to planning outcomes. It's going to rock the boat. It's going to change the way we do planning. But I argue from the outcome point of view that it will give us a better world. So I hope that answers the question.
No, thank you so much, because that leads us very nicely into the next question I have for Jim, actually, because Jim, when we look at Hong Kong's so constrained by lack of natural resources. I think you made that point quite amply, and really our kind of future lies in how we interconnect, and I think one thing is that the interconnection is physically there, but institutionally, how are we going to get around that?
Well, that's a good question. I think a little bit complex, because we're dealing about different regulatory regimes, different market characteristics between the mainland and Hong Kong. But I think the first thing is to make sure that the nation, the country as a whole, is united with the same objective. So there's a slight distinction I mentioned this morning. Hong Kong's achievement for net zero is 2050, mainland is 2060, but both countries clearly moving in the same direction. For us, having that government-to-government agreement in terms of the broad framework on which we operate is really, really important. So even today, CLP brings in nuclear power from the mainland through to Hong Kong. And we actually own assets in the mainland that help us do that. And the regulatory compact between the two governments is really important in providing that framework for us to do so. So again, to quote Daya Bay as a very simple example, one of the very first FDIs in the mainland. And the construction of that plant was underpinned by hard currency, Hong Kong dollar, US dollar, arrangements for power offtake. So working together across the boundary makes sense. And that's something I expect to see quite a little bit more of in the future.
Just a follow-up, there was a question raised on the role of nuclear in that.
There is, but I think China clearly has seen nuclear as a way forward to help with its own decarbonisation. I think many different fuels, different technologies are going to be necessary, but nuclear has an advantage in the sense that it is dispatchable, it's predictable, so it's not dependent upon the weather, and that can provide capacity as well as energy for us. So I think it will have an important role moving forward, and the mainland is building new nuclear plants in Guangdong. Whatever Hong Kong's view on those plants, they're going to get built. So the issue is, do we want some benefit from that in the sense of being able to secure some additional supplies? But not only nuclear, but also offshore wind. I mentioned a lot of offshore wind development in the mainland. That's now reducing in cost as the turbine technology matures. And that may be another opportunity for us to look at, let's say, some of the waters around Hong Kong that are actually in mainland jurisdiction, but where Hong Kong is the closest point to bring that power to land. So there are a number of opportunities we should follow through on.
Okay, I'm going to kind of switch the conversation here because it's clean energy, isn't it? We're looking at, well, zero energy, zero emission energy, which is all the things that we spoke about. There's a cost to it, isn't there? There's going to be a cost to clean energy. And actually, I want to prime the panelists ready for my next question, because who's going to pay for this cost? How are we going to get all this money for clean energy? Jim, whilst you got the mic, perhaps give us your quick thoughts, and I'm going to throw the one to Stephen on the carbon markets to see whether there's options there.
Okay, so firstly, in terms of costs, now that's important to us. We want to make sure that customers don't pay any more than they need to pay. So as we move forward through the energy transition, what we want to try and do is repurpose and reuse the assets that we have whenever we can. So for example, today we're still working on completing our D2 combined cycle gas unit at Black Point. That's a state-of-the-art gas turbine, but in future it will be capable of using hydrogen. So we don't have to build a new station for hydrogen. We've actually procured technology which will allow us to blend up to about 30% green hydrogen in the fuel mix. We're also today, as I mentioned, fitting smart meters for all residential customers. This summer, we ran our first pilot where we arranged for customers to reduce their demand at a time in summer when the system's under a little bit more pressure. We paid them to do so, but that actually helped reduce the maximum demand at the very hot days we had in July. And that means I don't have to build so many new generation facilities in the future. I can make our system more efficient. So customers have to contribute, yes, in terms of the cost they pay, but the power companies also need to do their bit.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Stephen, are you ready?
Sure.
My question is about the voluntary carbon market, because you compare it to the compliance market. I mean, it was quite small, and Hong Kong's experience with carbon markets in the past has not been great. What makes you think it's going to be different this time?
Well, first of all, I think that as mainland China is relaunching really the ETS market, I think one thing that we really want to do from a policy perspective is to ask them to recognize the voluntary carbon credit that we trade in Hong Kong. If they do so, then obviously there is a use case for the voluntary carbon market traded in Hong Kong. I think that would create a bigger market and use cases for the future. So therefore, the ability to use our voluntary credit into offsetting some of the compliance market, which is bigger and bigger in China, I think that's one of the key to really build our voluntary market.
You mentioned different players, sellers and buyers.
Yeah.
I mean, who are you thinking of? I mean, beyond the institutional buyers, would you see companies like utilities?
Yeah,
or
definitely.
Companies
yeah, I'm thinking, frankly, hopefully this is not just a market of financial institutions. And hopefully this is a market of, like what you said, utilities or aviation companies, like a lot of airplanes, right? They need to be able to use the carbon credit than actually to offset what is required under CORSIA, which is going to be mandatory in a couple of years globally. So I think this is something that is of interest because the aviation market is such that they actually can use not bound by locality. I mentioned before that in California, for example, they can only mostly use the voluntary credit in California. But in the aviation market, in the future, actually, they are now arguing that you can use voluntary carbon credit everywhere in the world to match the requirement for the aviation companies. So I think this is going to be interesting. Again, you know, the more use cases that you have, the broader the voluntary credit market will be.
Okay, thanks. My next question is for Kevin, to bring in the construction industry into this. I mean, obviously carbon credits may not be top of your priority, but you did talk a lot about embodied carbon. When you showed that pie, you know, in operational carbon and embodied carbon, and suddenly the pie got very, very small when we talked about operational carbon. But embodied carbon is not the attractive part of decarbonization. I mean, I suspect a lot of people in the audience here, unless they're in the profession, wouldn't have been thinking of that when they think of net zero. How do you make embodied carbon? How do you make scope 3 sexy? I mean, how do you get the, you know, the interest in there? You've talked a lot about technology, you talked about processes, but at the end of the day, how do you attract capital into that area?
So the interesting part of it is, and I made the reference to the carbon action plan, is just because it's not detailed doesn't mean to say it doesn't count. And we're still going to be polluting. Embodied carbon is still polluting. And so whilst operational carbon may be, as you say, at the sexier end, it's not necessarily the case when you drill down into your supply chains. And for me, one of the things that, if we look back to the comment of how many people are able to measure, so how I behave influences my customers' carbon. How my supply chain behave influences my carbon. And so for me, it's regardless of whether it's operational carbon, embodied carbon, end-of-life carbon, we've got to deal with it at every single step of the way. And for me, one of the things I spoke about when I was talking about aligned interests. And we've got to have interests that are aligned with our customers. And very much when we're talking about working with these types of customers, they care about who they're partnering with in terms of how their performance and how that performance may impact on their own reputation. I remember there was a few weeks ago, Jonathan and I were talking at the Rethink event, and Jonathan made the comment that it's not a case of whether it's about doing the right thing. Going forward, you're not going to be able to access the finance markets unless you're standing up and being counted with regard to your carbon performance. So I think one of the key things for me, again, I referred to the journey on carbon exactly being that. It's a journey. And we've got to get everybody on board with it. And the more I'm on board with it and taking care to ask my supply chain questions, then they're starting to understand what we need to achieve. And at the same time, my customers are asking me questions about how I'm performing. And so everybody needs to be on this journey together, and everybody needs to be moving forward. Some will be faster than others, but sooner or later, doing business will also be about how you can stand up and be counted with regard to your carbon performance. Not just about your financial performance, but your carbon performance as well.
So it's about reputation as much as anything else.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But not just about reputation. Your performance becomes your reputation.
Your performance, right. Well, that's a nice segue into Jonathan. Your talk actually very nicely linked up towards the end, the message about ESG and finance. And you made some very cogent points there. And in fact, some of the questions that have come out here about ESG, there's two that I want to read off here. One was ESG and net zero carbon. Are we forgetting the S in there? I mean, are we kind of like, you know, over-laboring the whole E part and forgetting the S? That's the first one, whilst you think about that one. Then the second one was that well, let me paraphrase this. Is sustainable finance for large corporations only? What about SMEs? You know, where do they get a take on this? So, Jonathan, I'm going to give you a double whammy on this one.
Well, Thomas, thank you. I'm going to add to my burden here because I'm bursting to make some comments on some of the earlier comments because I think Professor Tai made a really important point about locational decisions based on carbon. That's already happening today. I mean, I talked in my talk about financed emissions, which is our Scope 3, Category 15. But if we're to meet our Scope 1 and 2, particularly our Scope 2 targets, we are making decisions about, for example, where we put our data systems based on whether we can get access to zero carbon power. And that's absolutely clear. We're also instructing our software engineers to look at how they utilize processing capacity to reduce emissions. So this does go very deep into Scope 3. So as Kevin said, Scope 3 may not sound sexy, but it is incredibly important. I think the other point I just wanted to make, and then I will get to the two specific questions. You talked about financial cost of clean energy. There is a financial cost, but I think the other thing that is important to recognize, there's also a carbon cost to clean energy. We can't make efficient wind turbines today without using coal, steel, or gas. We need to use the old energies to actually drive the transition to the new energy. And I think that's often forgotten in the global debate. It's balancing the phase in and the phase out. It's not just about running away. And this is why when I talked about financed emissions for a financial investor, it's not just about achieving those targets, because we could do that by simply closing the bank. If we closed the bank, in my view, we'd have made very, very little contribution to the transition. So it's got to be positive action as well as moving away from financed emissions. I think Kevin answered the embodied question very well, but of course, if you're a cement company, a steel company, a chemicals company in that materials space, those aren't your Scope 3, they're your Scope 1 and 2. So it's engaging across all sectors, and in a sense, finance has the role of bringing that together. And then the point on ESG, are we forgetting the S? We're probably not giving it enough attention. I don't think we're forgetting it. As I said at the outset, the carbon bit has and the climate bit has so many S consequences. I think that's the big one, and we're right to focus on that, but not to the exclusion of S. So we need to think about our communities and how we impact them. We need to think about this concept of the just transition as we move away and we shrink the high carbon industries. Where will those people find their new jobs? How do we build those sectors and those activities that will replace the jobs that have to be lost in the transition? We have to take that into account. So the S very much impacted there. And finally, on the SME point, the SME really comes back to Scope 3. Scope 3 is critical. Right. A lot of companies, their Scope 3 is the performance of the SMEs. So again, absolutely critical, important, and the bit that banks can and I think are trying to do is to create again some of these incentive mechanisms such that the procurer can create incentives through sort of what's technically often referred to as supply chain financing that rewards and compensates the SMEs in the supply chain for better sustainability performance.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to chip in? Yep, please, Stephen.
Actually, recently there are two groups of SMEs approached, and I had this discussion about how SME can get involved in the ESG discussions, and obviously based on the fact that they hope to get better financing as hopefully better business, right? Because of the Scope 3, they know that they need to be part of this discussion, particularly the group that I spoke to in the construction supply chain. So obviously they don't directly have this listing requirement for disclosures, but they knew that this is a survival for them in the future. Now, so from a policy perspective, obviously I would have to think, we really have to think about what sort of policy that we can enable them to actually, one, yes, if they do it, they get proper recognition, because there's really no sort of a lot of whatever recognized certification for them. If they do something, then they would be deemed as a good partner, and therefore they can get more business. So one, from a sort of certification and recognition perspective, and second is from a financing perspective. And when we talk about green finance, frankly, in Hong Kong, a lot of times we talk about sort of, you know, being a global finance center means that we're trying to get global issuers to match with global capital. So a lot of SMEs are asking, so what about us? We are not neither global issuers nor global capital. So, you know, can there be green money to help me, to actually finance me as a local SMEs in this process? So, you know, is a global finance center as Hong Kong be able to be helpful to small local SME? I think that's sort of the other question that not just from a banking perspective, but really from a regulator perspective, do we have that sort of regulatory incentives for banks to sort of, you know, lean on some SMEs to give them some leeway as they do a bit more green when they're asking for a credit that they would not otherwise be able to get.
Great. Okay, Professor Tai, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was going to make a comment about the several S word here. I think first and foremost, I think we have to stop thinking of making sustainability sexy. Sorry about that, Thomas. For too long, we try to, you know, make it attractive and thereby go the way of making exciting artificially. But people need to know the hard science and hard facts. This is not really a time for gratification. It is really about a time of knowing what is wrong and take the necessary action. I totally agree that I think the scope 1, 2, 3 discussion cannot be seen in isolation, especially scope 3. I know that many of my friends in the industry tells me that let's tackle scope 1 and 2 first, worry about scope 3 later. I know that you need to prioritize, but scope 3 is really where the crux of the issue lies. And a lot of it, I agree with the previous comment that the SMEs really play a big part. But until the big players say that they want to tackle all 3 scopes, they're not going to pull the rest of the SMEs along. And I'm appreciative that the green finance institution people are thinking about the SMEs. I think that has got to happen faster than later. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I also add a thing about S? Because, oh, sorry, time's up. So quickly, I think S, social, in a way, frankly, I think E is a bit more science-driven, right? S, in order to make it really a social science, right? You're trying to actually create a measure the social impact under the social science framework so that you can actually measure, okay, if you do this, what are the social impact? That has to go through a lot of, obviously, the randomized trials experiment that need to be done in social science. And I think that is, you know, from a policy perspective or from an academic perspective, in order to quantify that, it's a lot harder than E. Not to say that you don't want to quantify it, but I think the whole global situation needs to work together so that, you know, from a social science faculty perspective, we can actually come up with more measurable, comparable social impact measurement at the end of the day.
Kevin, you look like you want to say something.
No, but I will, because when I look at the impact, Jim mentioned earlier a project like D2. I'm working on D2 as part of Jim's supply chain. But the conversation I have with the leadership of CLP is, what do we do right on this project to fix it for society? So at ground level, it's a business transaction. Yeah. But when we have the conversation, we're talking about how we do everything right to bring that project to fruition that's delivering for the benefits of society. So you move from an E to an S conversation. And so for me, it's interrelated. If I want my supply chain to move on and start to pay attention to how they're reporting their numbers to me, I have an influence over hundreds and hundreds of SMEs by paying attention to it. So that then helps the sustainability of their own businesses and the employees that work within those businesses. So for me, there's a lot of interconnectivity between them.
Okay, thanks.
And
Johnson.
Thomas, I'm conscious of time, but maybe one for you, going beyond scope 3, how you engineers design solutions for your clients that fall outside your 1, 2, and 3, perhaps scope X, scope 4. I mean, this is the other critical area, the sort of the influence that Kevin's talking about. We all have extensive influence and I think we really need to tap into that urgently.
Interesting. Jim?
Just one final appeal, if I can. We're running out of time. We need to move quite quickly, not just in terms of the monitor down there, but in terms of climate change. There are things that you can do today with your suppliers, with your electricity company, with others in your network to save carbon, to help us move forward by working with your suppliers, working with your friends, looking at how you use transport, looking at how you consume, looking at how you reduce, looking at how you recycle. So one point I want to make is, please don't wait for the annual report, for the ESG reporting cycle. Do what you can today, this afternoon. It will make a difference. Thank you.
Okay, we have 25 seconds left. Oh, we're on red already. Okay. All right, I'm going to wrap this up, but does anyone have any last comments before I kind of try to summarize some of the points here? Okay. No, excellent. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your contributions. I mean, it's brought the discussion together. I thought when we started off, we had some fairly diverse kind of industries and interests represented here, but it does seem that we do have common interests, because at the end of the day, to get to net zero, it is a collaborative act that we need to bring all different players in, and we look to see what is the best way of bringing people in. I think from Jim's point of view, I mean, we're also been talking about scope 3, you know, which is the biggest bugbear, but at the same time can actually bring in a lot of different players. Jim's point is that you're the one who's worrying about scope 1, the biggest headache on your agenda. But if we can get that right, I mean, given that the options we have, again, playing on the collaboration aspect, it is not Hong Kong's problem alone. We can actually solve this if we collaborate with the right players. And I'm hoping that the mechanisms, the technologies, the financial products, the markets that we've spoken about are really the right means that we can advance towards them. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up. I think we're now, you know, standing between the audience and lunch, gentlemen. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you all, Professor Tai, Jim, Kevin, Jonathan, and Stephen, for your contributions. It's been a pleasure and a privilege for moderating this panel. And thank you to the audience.